welcome back to Euangelion Radio. I thought, instead of getting on here each week and rambling on about really just the end times and tradition, which is what I've been doing, and church history, why not do a series on something meaningful? As you'll notice, this isn't a live video, and it will probably be 6 or so weeks before I do another live video. I'm in full swing right now between youth group, school, master's program, harvest, working a nice clean 60 hours a week. I'm also teaching a theology class on Thursday nights. So rather than attempt to jump on live every Tuesday and Thursday, I decided we're going to do a series, pre-record it, post it. We'll do it that way. And I wanted to start with, one of the great things about farming is harvesting really, almonds, it is almonds, not almonds, is you're sitting in a tractor for 10 hours a day, or in my case, a shuttle. And I have this little expo marker to mark how many shuttle loads I'm doing and how many trucks we've done for the day. And then I also have 8 windows around me. And the glorious thing about 8 windows around you is you get to jot down ideas all day long. And so plan messages, notes for teaching series. And then I just jotted down a bunch of series I wanted to do for this podcast. I want to do a series on Revelation. I would like to do a brief series on church history. I would like to do a series on Gnosticism. So I got a lot of series going on in my head that I would like to do, but I wanted to start with one that is kind of always in the front of my mind. It's one of my favorite topics. It is my favorite topic, not just one of them. It is my favorite topic when it comes to doctrine and theology, and that is the 5 points of Calvinism. I thought, let's just start out, hit it hard with the 5 points of Calvinism. The 5 points everyone hates and only a few love. Notice I say everyone hates them and a few love them as well, in addition to their hatred. That's a very nuanced phrase, but it was TULIP, as it's called, 5 points of Calvinism. It was something I was not comfortable with when I first learned about it. By no means was I comfortable with it. I actually hated it. It was the worst thing ever. I was in Master's Commission in 2015, soaking in a ton of theology. And then we would have these, it was every Wednesday or Thursday. I think it was Thursday because I think we called them Theology Thursdays. The senior pastor of the church would come in and give us theological lessons on kind of whatever. And it wasn't like the rest of the week was Bible studies, teaching series, and reading books. But Thursdays was kind of just like dropping theological bombs on us. And one day, probably 3 or 4 months into, it might have been towards the end actually. One day, anyways, he came in and said, do you have a choice in your salvation? And we all said, well, yeah, like we chose God. And God chose to redeem us because we chose him. And anyways, he went through these 5 points of Calvinism. And I was like, I wasn't disrespectful, and I didn't say everything I wanted to say to the senior pastor, but I was like, how on earth could you believe this is such an evil doctrine? That's what I hear from people today. There's a person at our church I've been talking to about this, and he said Calvin was an evil man and he was a heretic. People don't like this doctrine, and neither did I. Made me think about my unsaved friends and how there's no hope for them is what I thought. But like everyone else, I really misunderstood the doctrine, and then I fell in love with it. I had to commit myself to the scriptures. We actually talked about this recently in our theology class on Thursdays. Going through John Frame's systematic theology, you see a lot of triangles because he deals a lot with what's called the Triperspective on God's lordship. And that triperspective kind of falls into all other things. And in the triperspective, you have the situational, the situational perspective, the normative perspective, and then the existential perspective. And someone asked me to clarify, and I use the example of me coming to Calvinism, coming to acknowledge and embrace the doctrines of grace. And I said, I was in this situation where I didn't like the teaching. It was against my tradition, and I factually did not agree with it. Then I moved from the situational perspective, and I had to let the normative perspective set the standard for what I should think. So I said, you know what? I don't like this. It doesn't agree with me. There's a facts situation, but I need to agree with Scripture over my own facts and over my own experiences. And then I had the existential, or the experience of it, of I don't like it, I hate it actually, but because Scripture reigns supreme, Scripture sets the standard, I must come to embrace it. And I really did embrace it without liking it for, it felt like a long time to me. It was probably only a year until I was in full-on cage stage Calvinism, which is when you're out there hitting everyone in the head with Romans 9, and you're just zealous for Calvinism. So, but it felt like a long time where I really struggled with, man, what a crazy doctrine, especially when you get into the L, which we're going to get into next. Are we next week? Next Thursday, September 10th. Wow, it's already September. But yeah, I didn't like it, and then I said, if Scripture teaches it, I must believe it, and I really do see that the Scriptures teach these 5 points. So today we're going to introduce the 5 points. What are the 5 points? Because I really didn't learn a lot about them. I'm going to keep this open once I open it. I didn't learn a lot about where the 5 points actually came from up until, I think, last year. So we're going to introduce the 5 points. Who made them up? Where do they come from? So on and so forth. So most will say Calvin made them up. And yes and no. John Calvin was the Swiss reformer in Geneva. If you go to Missional Wear, I've shown this many times, you can get a little statue of John Calvin. A bust, I believe they're called. They also have Spurgeon, Luther, I think Augustine. They have Augustine as well. But he was the reformer in Geneva, right? So Reformation was a retreat ad fontes, back to the sources. And for them, it was back to the sources of Scripture. What does the Scripture say? Scripture must rule our life. It must reign supreme over all things. It must be the defining standard. And so Calvin, again, was a reformer in Switzerland, Geneva, Switzerland. Sorry for the burping. And he wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion. This might not seem like a big book to some, especially if you're, a heavy reader. But then you open this thing, and it's pretty small print, and the margins are not very thick. Big book is actually 4 books, just going through his doctrine. And so you will find these 5 points of Calvinism within Calvin's Institutes to the Christian Religion. You'll find his theology in there, obviously, but you will not find a section on the 5 points. You won't find a section on total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints in that order, treated in the way that we would treat it today, or how I'm even treating it here. He came up with the doctrine, and I want to be very careful in saying that he came up with the doctrine, because he didn't come up with a doctrine, really. What he really did was, I'm going to say, rediscover it, refresh it, and bring it back to the minds of believers. Obviously, God came up with a doctrine in Scripture, and even after the apostolic age, Augustine, however you want to say his name, was another someone who brought this up as well. Our will is not absolutely free, and that we are elected and predestined by God. So Calvin, he didn't found the doctrine. He didn't come up with the doctrine, but he did refresh it and bring it back to attention. But it's important to note that he did not himself create the 5 points of Calvinism. It's important just for history's sake. There's another man around the same time or shortly after Calvin, called Jacobus Arminius. And he was educated in Leiden and Geneva, right where Calvin was. He actually studied under Theodore Beza, which was Calvin's successor. Calvin's very close successor. And he was taught at Leiden. Controversy arose around what he taught, but it was hard to nail down what Arminius taught because he didn't write anything down. He didn't want to. And so it's like nailing Jell-O to a wall. His teachings were primarily communicated through what he taught his students. And that's kind of a scary thought. I think today, my basic theology students that are in their 5th week of basic theology, would they represent my theology well? I'm not saying my whole theology because we obviously haven't gone through it, but what I have taught them, would they represent what I think well? So it's scary to think that his teachings were scary for him. His teachings were primarily communicated through his students. He was required in 1608 to write down his teachings to be evaluated by the government. There's been some recent discussion lately on Twitter with Timothy Keller and some people like that about how Calvin lived in a kind of a theocracy. And so the government demanded he write down his teachings to see if they were accurate, if they were scriptural, if they were theologically sound. And when he wrote this down in 1608, it revealed and affirmed that he stood against Calvinism. Now, when we talked about the history of theology and philosophy in the church and in the world, in basic theology, we talked about how really we can summarize this whole thing, the last 2,000 years, as a fight for autonomy, as humans fighting to be free from God in their thinking and rationality. And a lot of people today, Arminians is what we call them, those who well, we'll get to that. A lot of them today are fighting for human autonomy, but most historians would note that, surprisingly, Arminius himself wasn't really fighting too hard to maintain human autonomy. I'm sure he did believe in human autonomy the way that most Arminians today believe it, but he wasn't fighting and standing against Calvinism just to defend the notion that we're not robots. He was really wanting to avoid the notion of a God that's a tyrant, that's author of sin, that is controlling. Which is kind of interesting, kind of flips the script there for a second. So that's Arminius, and he plays an important, that's where the term Arminian comes from. Most of Christianity in America today Christians in America today are Arminians by default, by tradition. And if you believe in the doctrines of grace, the 5 points of Calvinism, then you'd be a Calvinist. But we have to be careful not to demonize Calvin and not to demonize Arminius. We have to treat them, this goes for all of church history, and then 1,000 years from now, I hope people treat us the same way. We have to be careful to look at these men or any people in history in their context. Calvin gets demonized a lot for being this, along with Luther, this harsh, evil person. And by our definitions of gentleness and kindness, and yes, perhaps Calvin was harsh, but he wasn't living in our times. He was actually known as a very gracious and kind man, a pastor of pastors. But we have to remember he was living in a different context. He was living in a theocracy, so punishment for things was a lot different. I mean, they would be today too if we lived in a theocracy. And Arminius recognized his heart, recognized that he wasn't trying to fight for human autonomy, and he wasn't, I don't think he was a heretic. I mean, I think he was a heretic, but I don't think he was an unsaved sinner that went to hell when he died. I just think he has his theology wrong. And so we have to be careful not to demonize the men themselves that we're talking about. And we also can't really say that Calvinists or Arminians are following Calvin or Arminius themselves. So we get accused of that a lot. Oh, you're a Calvinist, you follow John Calvin over Jesus. No, Calvinism is just a word that signifies and summarizes what I believe about these certain doctrines. Arminianism does the same thing. Those people are not following Jacobus Arminius. They just believe in the doctrines that are summarized by the term Arminian. So we've got to be careful and slow to judge people in what they believe and judge the men who lived 400 years before us, when things honestly, theologically, were a lot better. So where do we get the 5 points of Calvinism? there was this thing called the Remonstrance. Okay. The Remonstrance was a response to Calvin and Calvinism by the students of Jacobus Arminius. And it must be noted that they radicalized Arminius's views on Calvinism and his views against Calvinism. Nonetheless, they developed the Remonstrants, the students of Arminius. They developed 5 points in 1610, and their 5 points were as follows: complete depravity, conditional election, universal atonement, resistible grace, and uncertainty of the perseverance of the saints. So they had these 5 doctrines. They came up with these 5 doctrines to come against Calvinism. They said, no, not everyone is totally depraved, completely, but not totally. We are selected on a condition that we first believe. Christ died for literally the sins of all human beings, that you can resist God's calling, and that no one knows whether or not a Christian will persevere to the end. So this caused a lot of unrest in the surrounding area. I want to say in Geneva. I don't know if it's in Geneva or not, though. To the point of civil war almost breaking out in Dordrecht, if I'm saying that correctly. So theological controversy almost led to civil war, and in around, when was it? 1618 to 1619, or 1617 to 1618. There was a council called the Synod of Dort that met together, and this Synod at Dordrecht prevented war. And it developed 5 points in response to the 5 points of the Remonstrance. So to respond back to the Remonstrance, which was saying Calvinism's wrong, and here's 5 points why, the Synod of Dort, the largest gathering in church history of churches to solve a church issue, said, no, here are the 5 points of Calvinism: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. So that we are totally depraved. God selects us on no conditions. His atonement is limited to those who he saves. His grace is irresistible, and those whom he saves will persevere to the end. So the 5 points of Calvinism came not from Calvin himself, but as a response to theological controversy and the neglect or the it was a counterattack on those attacking the doctrines of grace, on the 5 points of Calvinism, or on Calvin's doctrine to begin with. So a few things I want to say before that's kind of it for this episode. I'm going to keep these short, by the way. A few things I want to say before we convene again on Thursday. It's already September, man. September 3rd. These 5 points they're hard to understand, not because they're hard to understand intellectually, but they're hard to hear. And if you're going to follow along, we're going to be doing this. We're going to talk about total depravity on September 3rd. We're going to talk about unconditional election on September 8th. We're going to talk about limited atonement on September 10th. And then we're going to talk about perseverance of the saints on September 15th. And irresistible grace on September 15th. And then finally, perseverance of the saints on September 17th. So we're going to go one by one talking about these. And they're hard to get. And if you're following along, I want you to be patient as we walk through these and really slow down and listen and look at the scriptures. One thing I tell people when talking about the 5 points of Calvinism, and it's something that the senior pastor at Master's Commission told us as well. He always said, look, I really don't care if you disagree with me on this, so long as you agree on the foundational doctrines of the Bible. I would say this is foundational, but this is not a closed-handed issue. It's not as if you don't believe the same soteriology, doctrine of salvation, that I do, that you're going to hell. We can disagree. If you don't think that we are totally depraved, that's fine. If you don't think we're elected unconditionally, that's okay. If you think Jesus died for the sins of every human being ever, think you're wrong, that's okay. If you think God's grace is resistible, that's okay. And if you don't think saints will persevere to the end, that's okay as well, so long as you believe that you're saved by grace through faith, by Christ alone, to the glory of God alone. So there's a lot we can agree on when we talk about the 5 points of Calvinism, and we don't need to disagree on the essential doctrines of the Christian faith, which is really belief in the triune God and that He saves, and it's by His grace and not by our works. So I will see you tomorrow, because I'm going to release this on Wednesday, since I'm recording on Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. I'll see you tomorrow, Thursday, September 3rd, to talk about total depravity. Have a great week.